Welcome, everyone. We're going to begin the webinar on COVID-19, Protect Your Shop, OSHA and EPA Compliance. I'm Melissa Joels with RDA Impact. Brandon Thomas, President of GMG Envirosafe, is your presenter for this webinar. The presentation will take approximately 45 minutes, and we are recording it and we'll post it on our YouTube channel. If you have questions during the webinar, you can type them in the chat box at the bottom right of the screen, or you can raise your hand and I can unmute you at the end of the presentation. Now I'll turn it over to Brandon.
Thank you, Melissa. Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for taking time out of your busy day to join Melissa and I. I hope you and your businesses are doing well and staying safe. I'm really excited to be here with you guys all today. I think the timing is great because we are just continuing to see tremendous amount of enforcement activity for collision and mechanical repair businesses around the country. I'm sure you guys are well aware, last year, the industry overall really didn't see a lot from inspectors. They were sheltered in place, they were working from home, they were furloughed during the pandemic, and so there really wasn't a lot of OSHA or EPA activity. But now, this year, we have seen them certainly make up for that lack of activity in 2020. In fact, we've had even a few inspectors tell us directly that not only are they doing their normal inspections for 2021, but they are visiting all of the businesses that they were supposed to inspect in 2020 to make up for lost time. So good timing to present this content to you. Now, before we dive in, just a quick disclaimer about myself and the company. GMG Envirosafe has been providing EPA, OSHA, and DOT expertise to the collision repair industry for over 30 years. For those of you that don't know me, prior to being the president of GMG Envirosafe, I ran a chain of 30 collision repair centers in Illinois and Indiana. So everything that I'm going to present to you today is from the perspective of a former shop operator. I'm not an attorney, and this presentation should not be used as a substitute for legal advice. Here's the agenda of what we'll be covering today. We're going to start with what prompts an inspection from the EPA or OSHA. Why do they come to your business? We'll walk you through the process of how inspections typically go for a collision center. And then we're going to dive into specifically what they're looking for and all the different best practices and policies that you can implement today to protect your business. So what prompts an inspection? Let's start with a very brief overview there. Agencies, whether they're on the environmental side or health and safety, are going to prioritize them based on an order of severity. First, an imminent danger situation would be a hazard or a condition that could reasonably be expected to cause death, serious injury, a large spill, or some type of a dangerous release of chemicals. So those get inspected first. Next on the priority list would be an inspection in response to a fatality or a catastrophe, which essentially functions as an investigation into what went wrong. Third, complaints or a referral from an employee or a former employee, or even just someone from the community would be given priority. Fourth would be an inspection tied to an emphasis program. Emphasis programs can be from all levels of government. We had recently in our industry a federal level emphasis program from OSHA around isocyanates that affected us because of the two-part products, clear coat activators and hardeners, that sort of thing. And at the same time, we've seen local OSHA offices have emphasis programs on different areas of the business. So we've got one area that's focused on automotive lifts because of injuries in their community. And so then they focus all of their inspection activity around businesses that have automotive lifts. Finally, a programmed or a routine inspection is the lowest priority. These are what we typically think of when we refer to a random inspection or ones that are tied to like an annual renewal of a permit or a license. Now, unfortunately, when it comes to regulatory inspections, I didn't know or no one told me is not an adequate defense to avoid a citation. Shops need to start the work before an inspector ever shows up to avoid a potential penalty. And what I think is the most important first preparation step is to have what you're seeing on the screen, which is a written policy on regulatory inspections, and then to train your employees on that policy. This policy should include language that non-supervisory employees, your estimators, your body techs, your detailers, are not allowed to grant access to inspectors. If your business doesn't have this policy, an inspector could walk through your shop even though you're out of the office because your CSR or your service advisor was attempting to be helpful. You're not there and citations get issued while you're not physically there with that inspector, and they'll stand up. You will have to pay those penalties if you do not have this type of a written policy. Second, in terms of what's in that policy, there should be a contact list in case somebody's out of town, basically a backup in the event that the owner is out of the country or on vacation, or the manager is completely out of pocket, that there's another person with authorization to grant them access. And then finally, the policy should cover your employees' rights throughout an inspection process. With the policy in place, then we have to train the employees. It's not good enough just to write something down on paper. We actually have to communicate it to the employees, and we want to document that that training occurred. Again, we do this before the inspector shows up, but we have to remember that there are whistleblower protections to ensure that businesses do not retaliate against their employees. So they have to be very careful with how we communicate this. We do not want employees to feel influenced by management during the course of an inspection, because the penalties for that type of influence or interference or retaliatory behavior become very, very expensive to businesses. The employee rights training should include a statement that says you will not retaliate if an employee decides to participate in an interview or answer questions for an inspector. Employees need to understand that there will be no attempt to influence their decision on whether or not they decide to participate in the interview. At the same time, we need the employees to understand that the things that they say can be used as the basis for a citation, even if they are wrong. You as a manager or the owner of the shop, you don't want your employees to guess or to speculate on answers if they just don't know something during an interview. Instead, they should just say they don't know. If they're a body technician and they ask about the paint booth, hey, that's not my department, that's not anything that I know about. They shouldn't be speculating on what that answer might be. Now, your employees do have rights when it comes to inspection interviews. They can choose to accept it. They can decline it. They can ask a manager to be present. They can ask a manager to be absent. They can have legal counsel present. The legal counsel could be their own. It could also be the shop's. They also can end the interview at any time, even if the inspector is not finished with their questions. You know, just because they started the interview does not mean that they are obligated to answer every single question that the inspector has if they would prefer to stop. Now, when the inspector arrives, you're going to have what's known as an opening conference. And it's important that you're courteous, respectful, and professional at all times when dealing with the inspector. Nobody likes to go through a regulatory inspection, but being disrespectful or hostile is only going to make the inspection go worse for the shop. When you meet with that inspector, first you're going to want to review their credentials. This is to confirm their agency affiliation. There's a ton of government agencies out there that are involved in some way with environmental health and safety, so you want to know who you're dealing with. I strongly recommend making a copy of a business card or a badge so you also know how to get a hold of that person in the event that you need to send them supplemental materials or you have questions. Next, you'll want to bring them into a private area, your office, a conference room, a training room, to complete this opening conference. You don't want to be doing this in the lobby or near the front desk where customers could be hearing it. And this is your opportunity during the opening conference to get specifics on the inspection. And you're going to want to take notes on everything that they tell you. So here are the questions that I think you should be asking for any inspection from a regulatory agency. It does not matter if you've been through the same fire inspection every year for the last 5 years. Always start with these questions. What prompted the inspection? Basically, why are you here? If they say, well, it's related to a complaint, ask for a copy of the complaint. Where does the inspector want to go in the shop? What repair procedures or operations does the inspector specifically want to view? What record keeping or documents does the inspector want to view? And then will the inspector conduct interviews with employees? And if that answer is yes, will these interviews be private? Now, the intention of asking these questions is to understand what is considered within the scope of the inspection. We do that because we want to restrict the inspector's access to only the absolutely essential parts of the shop, the equipment, the repair operations, employees, and records that are within that scope. Everything that is outside of the scope of the inspection should not be reviewed. But this is entirely dependent on you or whomever is walking with that inspector. We had a shop in Missouri that an inspector came in for a routine air quality inspection. I said, hey, I want to see paint-related records. I want to review their paint booth and the mix room. Manager's been through this before. They're tied up, they're busy, they're short-staffed, didn't think it was a big deal. So he just allowed the inspector to walk the shop by himself. Hey, you know where the paint booth is. It's out there in the back. And go talk to my head painter, Joe. He'll get you whatever you need. Then the manager goes and sits down in his office and continues with whatever it was that he was working on. The inspector meets with the head painter. He conducts his business. He looks around the paint department. And then he starts to get curious about other items that he couldn't immediately see. He starts opening up trash cans. He starts looking in inventory, and he finds an aerosol can in the dumpster outside of the building that had a little bit of propellant and chemical still inside it. It wasn't technically empty. That one aerosol can ended up being an $8,000 penalty. And this situation and the subsequent financial cost could have been completely avoided had the manager walked with the inspector and kept them within scope. That was not a waste inspection. Same goes for record keeping. The last thing we want to do is just turn over all of our files to an inspector and let them pick through whatever they want. Instead, during the opening conference, we find out what they want to see. Let's say it's a safety data sheet for your primer. Well, then the GM doesn't give them all the folders or all the files or the binder. Instead, he or she would just hand him the SDS for the primer. Again, we narrow the scope of the inspection, and it significantly reduces the exposure to the business. Now, we talked about employees' rights. The shops, as businesses, have rights as well. A shop has the right to refuse an inspection. Shop can delay an inspection if it would be what's known as considerably disruptive to that business. And what we mean by that is the regulatory agency has to inspect at reasonable times and regular hours. They can't ask you to come in at midnight or something like that. If the business isn't normally open on a Saturday or a Sunday, they can't have you come in and do the inspection at that time. Also, when we're talking about disruption, this could be for a number of reasons. This could be because you're extremely short-staffed. Maybe you've got a lot of people out on vacation, or they're out ill, or maybe certain management personnel, they're at off-site meetings, or they're going to a conference, or they're at SEMA, and they're not available to participate. Finally, if there's a process that just cannot be stopped without causing a financial burden, it can be considered an unreasonable disruption. So let's say we've got a vehicle in the booth, and your painter is literally in the act of spraying. They can't make the painter stop, remove the vehicle from the booth, and then inspect the lights in the booth. That would be what's known as an unreasonable disruption. Now, the caveat there is if that painter is doing something very dangerous, or they're just spraying in the open air, well, then the inspector can stop that activity because it's now a health and safety concern or an environmental concern. A quick reminder, although a shop can refuse or can delay an inspection, it is still relatively easy for that inspection or that inspector to obtain a search warrant and come back in a few days. Shops should not hear this presentation and think that, oh, I can just refuse an inspection forever, or I can just never be in the office and delay it 6 months. The reality is most businesses in our industry have some type of environmental related operating permit or a business license through the state that grants inspectors access during, again, reasonable times and reasonable hours. So our recommendation to our clients is to only refuse or only delay an inspection if it's absolutely necessary. So you met with the inspector, you did the opening conference, you understand what repair operations, what equipment, what chemicals, what they want to do while they're there. Now you want to make sure that you're thinking through what you're going to show them and when. You want to take the most direct path to these items in your facility. So if you're a shop that has multiple buildings, or if your paint and material, bread carts, or storage is in the rear of the building or in the parts department, I would recommend, again, taking the most direct path or even walking around the outside of the shop to go towards the back of the building through the parking lot rather than cutting right through the middle of the shop where they could possibly observe a technician welding or grinding, and maybe they identify a compliance opportunity that could result in a citation. First thing I always did with my shops is ensure the inspector has the required personal protective equipment to walk the shop. Safety glasses, maybe hearing protection, depending on your environment. This gives you the opportunity to think through, okay, where am I going to take this person and where am I going to start based on what they want to see. The second bullet on the slide is, again, the most important thing. We just talked about it. You have to accompany the inspector at all times. I know everybody's busy. I know there may be customers waiting. I know the day-to-day reality of a collision repair business. It is very, very demanding in terms of the attention that needs to be done with vehicles and customers and programs and estimates. However, you just do not want to have a regulatory inspector wandering through your facility without any type of accompaniment by a management or ownership representative. You definitely don't want to pair that person up with a body technician or a detailer and ask them to walk them through the facility. The reason for that is everything that they're doing while they're there is gathering evidence. That evidence can be used as the basis for a citation and a financial penalty. Now, you do not necessarily get access to their evidence, which is why you have to accompany the inspector. Anything that they take a picture of, anything that they take a note of, you're going to want to take a picture of it and you're going to want to take a note of it, even if you don't necessarily know what it is. We have had customers where the inspector takes a picture from a certain angle and it looks like, hey, that parts cart or the welder is absolutely obstructing a fire extinguisher or an eye wash station. But then the client takes the same picture from the side at a slightly different angle, and you could see that they had more than 3 feet of clearance in front of it. Now, we would have had a much harder time getting the citation thrown out if we did not have our own photos and notes from that manager. If an inspector asks you a question, you're going to want to answer them truthfully, even if you don't know the answer. As a manager or a management representative, you don't want to say, I don't know. That would reflect pretty poorly. Instead, you'll just tell them you'll get them an answer. And then finally, as you're doing the walkthrough, correct any violations that get pointed out by the inspector immediately. If the funnel on the paint waste drum is open, close it. If something's blocking equipment, move it. Small spill on the floor, clean it up. The welding cylinders aren't chained up to the wall, reattach the chain. This immediate abatement of items goes a long way to avoiding a citation. Technically, they can still issue you a penalty. They could still issue you a citation, even though it was corrected. But a lot of times what we see in practice is if they're immediately correcting these issues, they don't add a financial penalty as well. After you've completed the walkthrough, it's important that you just don't let the inspector leave the business without first having a closing conference. Ask them to come back to the meeting room, ask them to come back to the office, Review a list of any hazards and potential citations that were observed. Ask for a timeline of when a written report will be available to you. Sometimes agencies will get this turned around in a day. Sometimes it takes 3 to 6 months. What tends to be a big surprise for shops is that most agency inspectors or compliance officers, especially within OSHA, do not have the final authority on whether or not to issue citations. We've had clients where an inspector says, hey, everything went great. I'm not going to issue you any citations. But then they go back, they meet with their supervisor, and the supervisor decides, hey, you know what? I am going to issue a penalty, and I am going to have a financial cost associated with it. This is why you have to have your own records and your own pictures in the event that an inspector tells you one thing and it turns out to not be accurate. I mean, even if the inspector says, hey, we plan on issuing a citation, or I'm likely going to issue one after talking with my supervisor, remember, stay courteous, stay respectful, stay professional. You are not doing you or your business any favors by getting antagonistic or escalating a situation with them. For the EPA, when it comes to citations, notice of violation typically gets issued electronically, providing you with a certain number of days to resolve a relatively small issue. For OSHA, or if the environmental agency observed a major issue, a formal written citation and notification of penalty will be delivered by certified mail. Again, this process can take several months, but once you get it, it's important to review it immediately. I have an example on the screen of what one of these citations looks like when it comes from OSHA. There's going to be basically an allegation of the violation. The specific regulation that's being referenced, which on the screen, that's that 29 CFR 1910.106. There'll be a description of what was observed, a date that it has to be corrected, and then a proposed penalty amount for that specific citation or item number. There is a lot of variability with penalties. It's not just a you did this, therefore this is the cost. They will adjust penalties based on a lot of different factors, like the history of the business. Have they inspected it before? The number of employees, the gravity or the severity of the violation. And then any good faith procedures that may be in place. So like if you have no health and safety program in place, well, then there's not much good faith to take into consideration. Whereas if you have a health and safety program in place, you're doing weekly inspections, you've done training, and there was just an unpreventable employee action or misconduct that occurred while the inspector was there, they'll factor that into the penalties. Now, generally speaking, a serious citation will have a penalty of up to $13,600. Not fixing a violation after a deadline is $13,000 for every day until it is fixed. And intentional or repeat violations, the penalty can get up to $136,000. Now, this is where you've been cited before by that agency for a similar issue, and then you did it again. Or if it was determined that you're intentionally doing something wrong. Let's say you're pouring antifreeze down a sewer drain instead of spending money to dispose of it with a waste hauler. That would be what's known as a willful citation. Now, when we look at collision repair as an industry across the country, we typically see regulatory inspections result in about 4 serious citations per inspection, which obviously you can do the math. That adds up very, very quickly when we consider the total cost for an inspection. When you get the written citation, you got to act fast. For OSHA, you got 15 working days to settle or appeal the citation before it becomes a final order. When it's a final order, you can't change it. For EPA-related matters, the response times will vary depending on what agency you're dealing with, but typically no more than 30 calendar days. If the alleged violation is not being contested, it must be abated or fixed. You'll have to fix the issue and submit proof. For example, that could be a picture of the waste drum properly labeled or an invoice from the lift company for completed repairs. During that response window, you can also schedule what's known as an informal settlement conference. This will be done with the area director of the agency, and you'll discuss the allegations, and you're essentially attempting to modify the citations. This is where you can settle the inspection. If you do settle it, you typically are going to have significantly reduced penalties if you fixed your issues quickly. If you're unable to settle the matter, you just cannot come to an agreement, you have two options. You either accept the initial terms of the penalties, or you contest the citation altogether and you go to court. Now, agencies typically do not want to go to court, as it's expensive and time consuming the same way it's expensive and time consuming for you. So you can have that in mind as you attempt to negotiate the penalties. Now, that doesn't mean you get everything that you want, but we generally see reductions of 40% or so of the initial amounts if this is your first citation. All right, so we reviewed a typical inspection. Let's change gears in terms of process and talk about what they're actually looking for. There's a lot of ground to cover. The scope is going to depend on what agency is at your business. So kind of breaking it down by category and by layer of government, the federal EPA is just unlikely to visit your facility. Businesses that are in this industry are too small when it comes to hazardous waste and wastewater and that sort of thing. Federal EPA is just not showing up unless there's a catastrophic issue. The inspection is typically going to come from the state's DEQ or DNR, and they'll focus on hazardous waste disposal, air emissions, or air quality. Some states have really large metropolitan districts like St. Louis, Nashville, Los Angeles, and those agencies function between counties and states. So if a district, like that metro district, if they show up or the county shows up, they're typically reviewing fire and hazardous material related items. Finally, if the municipality is at your facility, they're typically focused on wastewater from your wash bays or your detail areas, and then stormwater discharges in your parking lot whenever it rains. OSHA inspections can come from all levels, local all the way up to federal. It just depends on what state you're in. Now, regardless of whether it's EPA or OSHA or different types of focus areas, they're all going to look for the same things: your written programs and policies, your record keeping in support of those policies, your employee training communicating what's ever in those policies, and then a walkthrough of the facility to make sure that you're keeping up with it. So let's start with your written programs. So this is basically all of the policies and procedures at your shop that are related to environmental health and safety. In collision repair, there's just a lot of written program requirements. We're just in a highly regulated industry. But depending on your shop setup, there are some that have to be present more than others. From a very high level, every shop in the country is going to need the programs that are on the left column. So hazard communication and the job hazard assessment is going to detail the chemicals, repair procedures, the different types of tasks that are performed at your shop, how an employee could be hurt, and what personal protective equipment or tooling that they are required to use for their safety. The injury and illness prevention plan is going to cover, if you have an injury, how do you respond to it, how do you investigate it, and how do you build it into your processes to make sure it doesn't happen again. Respiratory protection program is going to explain the types of respirators, the medical evaluation process, and the fit testing policies at your shop. Emergency action plan is focused on basically the procedures to protect your employees if there was a large spill, explosion, there was a major weather event like a tornado or an earthquake. Fire prevention plan is the procedures for chemical storage, handling, and repair processes like welding to ensure a fire does not occur at your facility. Spill response plan is how you clean up small spills, how you contain large spills, and what agencies you notify if a spill gets into a stormwater drain or nearby property. And then lockout tagout is basically for ensuring that no one is accidentally electrocuted because equipment is turned on when it's being repaired or maintained. This one's becoming even more critical for shops because of high voltage electric vehicles becoming more predominant within the US fleet. Finally, hazardous waste determinations. not necessarily a written program, but it is a required policy on all the different waste that's generated at your shop, what you've done to determine whether or not it's hazardous, universal, special waste, and then how you've profiled that waste with your waste hauler to ensure it's being transported and disposed of in a safe manner. Now on the right side, these are what's known as our conditional written programs. They might apply to your shop, they might not. So if you have a forklift, you need to have a powered industrial truck program that documents your operator training, your equipment maintenance procedures, that sort of thing. Spill Prevention, Control, and Countermeasure, or SPCC program, is required if you have bulk oil storage of more than 1,320 gallons. So if you're a hybrid shop and you're doing a lot of mechanical repairs or oil changes, then you typically are going to have above ground tanks of new and used motor oil. You would need to have this program in place. Finally, some areas have stormwater pollution prevention program requirements, dealing with materials like tires that are stored outside. They basically don't want runoff going into the storm drains that could have chemicals or debris. We see these often if shops are also functioning as a towing yard or have a towing division. Next would be your record keeping. And this is, again, essentially your ongoing documentation that you are living up to the written programs that your business has established. I've broken all of these into different categories on the different types of environmental matters that could come up. So let's first jump into EPA from an air quality standpoint. Now, again, depends on the market. California is very different than Texas, but some of the core things they're going to look for is if you're doing any type of refrigerant work with a Robin Air machine for 134A or 1234YF, you're going to have what's known as a Section 609 certification for anyone that's using the equipment, as well as a registration for the machine itself. The purchase or usage records for any VOC containing material will be reviewed. This is your paint, this is your solvent, your gun washer solution. Typically, you're going to have to document how much you're using on a daily or monthly basis, and then calculate your overall emissions related to hazardous air pollutants. And then finally, 6H NESHAP, this is the federal EPA regulation that requires painter training every 5 years, documentation of HVLP spray gun transfer efficiency, and documentation of the capture efficiency of your exhaust filters in your spray booth. That's all just air quality. Now, if the inspection is hazardous waste related, they're going to want to review basically any laboratory testing that was done to determine whether or not something is a hazardous waste. For body shops, we typically see this for wipes, the paper towels or wipe balls. We see this for sanding dust, and we see it for paint booth filters on the exhaust that capture overspray. Beyond the analytical reports, they're also going to want to review your hazardous waste manifests, basically your shipping records, anytime you disposed of a regulated waste. Now remember, just because you hire a licensed waste hauler does not mean you as the business do not have liability. Keeping these records is really important because since you generated the waste, you are responsible for it cradle to grave. The requirement for shops is to maintain 3 years of records for hazardous waste shipments, but we encourage our clients to keep those records indefinitely. Third on the list, hazardous materials. This type of inspection, they're going to want to review a chemical list of the hazardous materials, which is going to cover your flammables, paint and solvent, anything that's corrosive, any of your compressed gas cylinders for the torch card or for welding. The list is also going to cover, where it is in your facility. Is it in a flammable cabinet? Is it in a mix room? Is it in the parts department? And how much of each hazardous material is present. Finally, wastewater inspections from the municipality. They're going to review your discharges. They're going to look at your oil water separators. They're going to want to make sure that you're cleaning it on a quarterly, semi-annual, or annual basis. It depends on the local requirements. And they're going to want to look at just the volume of washing that you're doing at your business. For OSHA records, record keeping is typically going to cover 300 and 300A. There's an example on the screen if you've never heard of these forms. Most shops around the country are required to keep these for 5 years. And it's basically a record of any work-related injury or illness that occurs at your facility in the previous calendar year. Form 300, that's the list of injuries. How many days were missed, What was the nature of the injury? They got cut, they got something in their eye, something like that. Form 300A is the summary of everything that happened the year before. If you've never heard of this, the 300A gets posted in your break room from February 1st until April 30th. OSHA is also going to want to see the safety data sheets, or SDS, for any chemicals that are in your facility. They'll want to see exposure monitoring for organic vapors in the spray booth, and then potentially a few more exposure monitoring depending on the type of exposure that different people have at your business. Employers are typically required to do some type of monitoring to determine what kind of safety equipment, and really the one that comes to mind is a respirator, that an employee would need to wear. Why are you selecting this form of respiratory protection? PAPR, fresh air, half face, full face, the types of filters. The only way you can really determine that effectively is by doing exposure monitoring. Your auto lifts and hoists need records of being inspected by a qualified individual annually to ensure they can operate safely. Your fire extinguishers and fire suppression systems, they're going to want to see maintenance and inspection records documenting at least an annual check. A lot of times fire suppression systems will also have a semi-annual check as well. Your eye wash stations, OSHA is going to want to review your weekly inspections of the units themselves and a change out of any fluid if you're using the self-contained style eye wash, not the plumbed. A lot of times those have to be drained and refilled every 90 days. Finally, each employee that wears a respirator, painters, painter helpers, body technicians, if they're wearing a tight-fitting respirator, they need a medical evaluation on file and then an annual fit test for the respirator that they're wearing. Beyond the record keeping, they're going to look at your training. So, shops basically need to demonstrate that they have a process for onboarding a new hire and then what's known as refresher or ongoing training for existing employees related to all their different environmental health and safety policies and regulations. Now, as an industry, this is a big opportunity for us. The regulatory requirement is for employees to be trained before they ever start to handle chemicals or waste, which typically means their first day of employment. Now, again, the training records that an inspector is going to want to see is going to depend on why they're there and what the scope of the inspection is, but the list on the screen is going to cover the majority of topics that could come up. Company safe policies, workplace hazards, PPE, they're all basically covering the different repair operations that the body tech or the painter is doing and how they need to do it safely. So if I'm a tech and I'm using a grinder or a DA, what PPE should I be wearing? For your respiratory protection training, it's going to cover storage, it's going to cover maintenance, it's going to cover how to use it, how to take it off, how to clean it, all those different requirements for respirators. Your chemical training covers the different classifications of hazardous materials, how a container has to be labeled. If I take lacquer thinner and I put it into a squeeze bottle, how do I label that squeeze bottle to be compliant and communicate the hazard effectively? How to read those labels, and how do I get more information from an SDS in the event of an injury or a spill? Emergency response training is for fires and severe weather events or chemical spills or chemical releases. Lockout, tagout, and bloodborne pathogen training is to ensure that somebody doesn't accidentally hurt somebody because they turn on equipment that was not safe, or what to do in the event that there's blood or bodily fluid or a syringe in a vehicle. Believe it or not, we have had customers with employees that have been stuck by a needle because they're, vacuuming out the seats, or they're reaching into a glove box, or they reach underneath a seat, and then they get pricked by a needle, and then there's these bloodborne pathogen awareness things that need to occur to protect them from HIV and hepatitis. And then finally on the screen, just overall pollution prevention, waste handling. If I'm spraying paint, I'm a painter. Where does the leftover paint go? Where does the paint cup or the liner go? If I've got cloth rags and they're saturated with oil, where do I put those? If I've got AA batteries coming out of one of my hand tools or a flashlight, where do I put the batteries? So each type of training on the screen needs to be demonstrated to an inspector to make sure that you as the business owner or the manager are effectively coaching your employees on the right things to do based on the policies and the written programs that are in place. So in the shop itself, what they want to look at depends on the agency. That's nothing new. We've talked about that throughout the presentation. If it's air quality, they're going to want to look at any product that has a VOC in it: paint, cleaners, solvents, gun washers. Every state has a limit of how many pounds of VOC can be present in each gallon of material. They're going to review what products you're using to confirm that the adhesive remover or the surface cleaner is not above their limit. Now, more often than not, we see violations in this area because technicians are bringing in chemicals from home. Consumer use products that you get from Walmart or AutoZone are not the same as business use when it comes to these restrictions. Air quality inspector is also going to make sure you're using the right equipment for refrigerant work and that your containers are all kept closed. Hazardous waste inspector is going to look at every drum and container that has waste in it. There's a list on the screen of all the different items that would be a regulated waste depending on your state. And the big enforcement trend in the last 5 to 7 years has been significant penalties from improper disposal of paint containers, liners, sandpaper, dust, oil filters, oily containers, and aerosol cans. Now, the requirement is basically that if I hold a paint container or liner upside down in any direction, I should not get a pourable stream of material. If I take it out of the trash and I got a pourable stream, it isn't an empty container, and that would be a violation. We've had millions of dollars in penalties for Cook's Collision and Service King and AutoNation from improperly disposing of hazardous waste in our industry. So be sure to review your state requirements for how they want those handled. This is a very sensitive issue. Even household items like batteries and light bulbs or fluorescent bulbs from the booth, they can't go into the trash. Instead, they get disposed of as a hazardous waste, or actually a universal waste is the technical term, and they need to be put into a proper container. Finally, wastewater, stormwater inspection. They're going to look at your drains, your oil water separators, your clarifiers, your parking lot to make sure that chemicals and residual materials or debris does not end up going into the wrong place, especially when it rains. This typically is also going to include a review of where you store your chemicals, inventory closets, cabinets, that sort of thing, to ensure that they're contained and there's no chance of paint or oil or antifreeze being spilled and then ending up in the water system. OSHA inspection, I pulled what I typically see as the most common violations in this industry. Inspector is going to review your equipment, such as lifts and jacks and stands, to ensure they're properly functioning and not damaged. They'll look at your welders and grinders and hand tools to verify that all of the guards are in place. You can see an example on the screen of a bench grinder. That was not the shop's equipment. That was a technician's equipment. And the shop paid a $20,000 penalty because it was unsafe to use. When this was initially discussed, the shop thought, well, we're not going to get fined because it's not our equipment. This is the tech's. And unfortunately, it just doesn't work that way. If your techs are bringing in their own equipment, whether that's jack stands or floor jacks, or maybe they're even their own welder, you have to ensure it meets your safe operating requirements so they don't bring on any liability to your business. Fire safety, another major focus area for OSHA and collision repair. The condition and accessibility of your extinguishers, your exits, your panels, your outlets are all going to be reviewed. Any containers or equipment that transfers flammable liquids will also be reviewed for proper grounding. This is typically the 55-gallon drum of solvent paint waste or the lacquer thinner that's got a pump on it to put it into a secondary container. Any compressed gas cylinder that you have will need to be upright, chained, and capped. If you're using a torch cart, the acetylene and the oxygen, they get separated by 20 feet when they're not in use. And then the big one that we see citations over and over and over again is your gasoline cans. Again, just because I can go to Home Depot or Walmart and buy a plastic 5-gallon can for my lawnmower at home does not mean it's OSHA compliant for a shop. If you're doing any gasoline storage, it has to be a metal safety can for up to 2 gallons. The largest container for a plastic gas can at a shop is 1 pint, which, let's just face it, it's not very practical for a top off or something that's ran out of gas. Finally, OSHA inspectors are going to want to review different procedures: spraying, grinding, mixing, gun washing, etc. They're looking to make sure that PPE is being worn, containers are labeled, whether that's the liners, the detail spray bottles, whatever that is, and then emergency equipment is readily accessible. I've got an example on the screen of an eye wash station where they put a shower cap over it because they're trying to keep it from getting dust and dirt on it. It's a good idea, but this was a citation because the employee, if they had irritating chemicals in their eyes and they had their eyes closed or they couldn't see very well, would not be able to have immediate access to this eye wash station because the shower cap is in place. So important that we're not creating a delay or a hazard by trying to have this type of equipment set up this way. And then finally, the gentleman in the upper right-hand corner with his beard underneath a tight-fitting respirator, a body man mask. Employees that are wearing these types of tight-fitting respirators have to be clean-shaven at all times. It's not just they get fit tested today, they shave, they pass their fit test, and then they get to grow out their beard for the next year. Every day that they wear a respirator, they have to be clean-shaven so that it has a proper seal. So I have covered a ton of ground on regulatory inspections, covering all the different layers of government and the different agencies. If you would like more information or need assistance on how to protect your employees, your business, your community, please know that we're here to help. Your compliance department, which you're seeing on the screen, is our signature program where GMG Envirosafe becomes a part of your team to get you the expertise, resources, and peace of mind that you need. We've got compliance experts throughout the country that are in collision centers every day, all day, that are happy to help with any of your programs and training and support to make sure that you are staying compliant in a cost-effective way. Additionally, my contact information is on the screen. If you have any questions, certainly happy to help. You can reach out to me via phone or email. Melissa, I haven't seen anything come over the chat, but just wanted to check with you. Did we have any questions from the audience?
No, we don't, Brandon. And this is excellent information. And I will make sure that, I send this to our entire membership as well as all of our shops. And I think, people can reach out to you directly. I'll have your information with that. So we really appreciate you doing this for us, taking time out. This is great information and every shop should know about this. So really appreciate that. So
Sounds good. Thank
I'm
you so
going
much.
to conclude our webinar and we'll be in touch with future training opportunities. Thanks so much. Take care.